By the way, did you all get the email about the reading? I was originally going to give you 3 chapters in the Tuckman book, or 2 at least, for this week, and instead I only gave you 1, knowing that you wouldn't read it if it were more than that. So the one I gave you is on socialism. It's called The Death of Jaurès. Okay, so do you have it? Have people picked it up? It is a long chapter, I'll admit. It's very good, though, isn't it?
I didn't start it.
What did you say? It's long or it's good?
I bought it yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's very long. But
It's very long. It's very long, but it's very good. Believe me, it's very moving if you get into it. In past years, I also assigned her chapter on the anarchists, which is called The Idea and the Deed. I can certainly, if any of you want to know about anarchism, I'm happy to copy that for you too. Let me know, whether now or in private. I'm happy to assign, obviously, more reading, but I'm trying to keep things manageable because I know most of you are, I think, struggling to keep up as it is with the readings. On the other hand, I sometimes have doubts about whether I should assign readings on anarchism to impressionable young people. Not to say any of you are anarchists, but no, it's actually one year I did assign that, and the students actually here really, they thanked me because they liked seeing a respectful airing, given to the views of these people. Yeah, in some ways it's an odd way of looking at the last several decades before the First World War. Basically, the last couple of weeks we're going to be looking at the First World War from a bunch of different angles. I think what I'm going to do this Friday, I'll start going into the background of the Eastern question and the Balkan crises. So we're looking at the Ottomans and obviously then the Austrians, the Serbs, etc. I want to do some general background because there's so many ways of approaching the whole matter of the First World War. It really is a dividing line kind of between what we might call the contemporary world, and the pre-modern world, between the modern and the pre-modern. Not just because it killed so many people and disrupted so many institutions and traditions. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, obviously it's the war that ended the Ottoman Empire. Same thing, though, is true of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Same thing is true of the Romanov Empire. So much of the modern world was born out of the wreckage of the First World War. We sometimes take it for granted, but there it is. Communism, the Cold War, everything really in the modern world, maybe not necessarily recent history. Although then again, if you look at the Iraq wars, of course, Iraq was this state which was obviously created essentially, on a map by, these kind of British cartographers after the First World War. Itself, of course, in the British sphere because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which, of course, was brought about by the First World War. You get my point. Everything really does go back to the First World War. And so geopolitics, diplomacy, obviously military history, all of that is extremely important, and we'll get to all of that in due time. But I wanted to spend at least some time today luxuriating in what we might call the more structural factors behind the First World War. Where did it come from? The title, at least in the syllabus for the lecture, what I call The Proud Tower, Europe Before the Storm. This is actually from a book by Barbara Tuckman. I'm going to have you read another one of her chapters next week. Now, Barbara Tuckman, I have to confess, is not a professional historian. She doesn't have a PhD, which means that Bill Kent probably wouldn't hire her. But that said, she's a great writer. She has a fantastic imagination, and even though sometimes she doesn't necessarily get all of the details right because she's not always up on the latest specialist debates, between scholars, she has a way of bringing history to life, which I think is actually ideal for the undergraduate, particularly if the undergraduate is not usually inspired by history. And what's curious is in some ways this book, The Proud Tower, the one I'm looking at this week, which looks at Europe before the First World War, was her own way of making amends for the book that actually made her reputation, the one we're going to see next week, called The Guns of August, which was about the outbreak of the First World War, which was all high politics and, kings and diplomats and aristocrats and so on. In this book, she said, well, look, after a while, I got kind of bored of all of that stuff, the diplomacy and, the sort of the military side, the plans, mobilization, the railway timetables. I wanted to look at what life was actually like before the war, in part because it was so different from what happened afterwards. And she's not doing a kind of universal social history, but what she does in the book that's so interesting is she looks at some of these dilemmas and forces shaping lives. Her argument, if there is one, and there's not really an argument, is that the First World War could not have come out of a time of simple peace and prosperity, even though it was a time of peace. I mean, you can call it the long peace, the peace in between the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the First World War, obviously punctuated by a number of wars, particularly those involving the Ottomans, the Crimean War maybe being the most significant, the Russo-Ottoman War being maybe next most significant in terms of the Eastern question, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 also counting. But the fact about all of those wars is that, with the partial exception of the Crimean War, they were all fairly short. You know, they didn't really disrupt lives in the way that the Napoleonic Wars had done, over a period lasting, again, 20 or 25 years in the case of the Napoleonic Wars. That's what they mean when they say the long peace. It's not that no wars happened, obviously they did. But for the most part, Europe was free to develop its kind of internal institutions, obviously to produce the vast wealth and technological advances of the 19th century and so on and so forth. What Tuchman tries to say, though, is that all of this is true. It was a long peace, a great time of progress and prosperity. All that was true. But there was a lot kind of seething, all of these forces seething beneath the surface of European life. You know, which, obviously, if you were alive at the time, you would have noticed, but which, in retrospect, people forgot about. In retrospect, there's always this nostalgia that overcomes us. It's kind of like what Talleyrand famously said about the old regime in France, that is, everything before 1789. He said, those of us, who were not there to appreciate the sweetness of life in the old regime can have no idea what it was like. Now, of course, he meant, if you were an aristocrat and you had money and wealth and, servants and you lived. And he had a point. Definitely, 18th century life was pretty grand. It was pretty great if you were, let's say, a French aristocrat. If you've seen that notorious movie, Dangerous Liaisons, it's probably before your time. John Malkovich plays this kind of rake of an aristocrat. Basically his whole purpose in life is just to seduce women, and then gossip about it and talk about it and write letters and then seduce more women. And some other women did kind of the same thing in reverse. It's just there was no other purpose to life than having fun and entertaining people and seducing people, and that's kind of, maybe it was empty, but it was kind of a nice life in a lot of ways. Now, the period before the First World War maybe wasn't quite as decadent as the last days of the French aristocrats in the 18th century. But that said, you can see why people after World War I look back at it with these kind of roseate glasses. They remembered this era when, to give you one example, actually compare it to today, you could travel anywhere in the world without a passport. Imagine that. Instead of getting in these security lines where they, pat you down and strip search you practically, which is like what they're doing today. Obviously, it helped to have either letters of credit or you could travel with, gold coins, silver coins, or whatnot. But basically, there was free movement across borders. World trade, in fact, if you just look at it in percentage terms, that is the percentage of economic activity which actually crossed borders, what we might call, again, crudely, globalization, was by some measures actually larger than it was in the 1990s and the last 15 years. World trade was booming. The economy of all the major countries was growing. Obviously, again, it helped if you were yourself wealthy, but on the other hand, the ranks of the middle classes were growing. Travel was easy. In fact, travel was a lot nicer back then, too, because it's sometimes been called the golden age of travel. Because although industrialization had already started, it tended to be concentrated in certain places. Now, it wasn't like today where almost anywhere you go in the world, you're going to see concrete buildings and factories and pollution and of course other tourists. That's the other thing. It's like today the world is just overrun with millions of tourists wherever you go. It was kind of nicer to travel back when some people had money, but not everybody. Places weren't as crowded. You could tour the ruins of, ancient Greece or ancient Rome, and chances are you and your party might be the only people there. Whereas like today, if you go down to Ephesus, you're probably going to run into at least like 150 obnoxious new Russians, along with the usual packs of German school children and tourists from America and pretty much everywhere in the world. The experience is different. So there was great wealth. On the other hand, it wasn't enjoyed by everybody. It was enjoyed by enough people so that there was kind of a general memory of prosperity. Life was simpler. You didn't have what you had after the First World War, with not only the massive spread of government. I mean, that's probably the biggest single change. There are others too. Cigarettes. Cigarettes were pretty much a fad before the First World War, and then suddenly everyone started smoking them because everyone had been in the trenches where, you had all this time to kill, so you'd smoke cigarettes. Paper money, that's another example. We take it for granted today, all the paper money we have in our wallets. People didn't used to trust paper money. And then in the First World War, governments started printing money by the bushload, and then everyone just had to deal with paper money, whether you liked it or not. Then there was government, the spread of government, where in most of the Western countries, the size of the public sector of the economy, didn't tend to be more than about 12 or 15%. Government was not that important a factor in most people's lives. You could go from day-to-day life without encountering, let's say, government bureaucrats, sometimes even without even seeing a policeman. Obviously, then in the 20th century, with the rise of not just totalitarianism, but also the bureaucratic welfare state, all of us now, on a pretty regular basis, have to deal with government agencies of one kind or another. Government now in much of Western Europe takes maybe 50% of the national income. At least 3 times as much as it did before the First World War. So all of these things are interesting. Interesting that there's a nostalgia for it, but of course, it's not as if we had this idyllic world that was just destroyed in 1914. Obviously, the causes of what happened in 1914, even if technically speaking the decisions finally were made by small coteries of diplomats, politicians, and generals, there were obviously larger forces at play, that plunged Europe from this seemingly endless peace and prosperity into this just abysmally destructive war, where in the end something like 50 million men were put in arms. There were 20 million people in uniform just by the end of August 1914. 20 million people. All of them not only in uniform, but of course possessing weapons and being trained in how to use them and being trained basically in killing other people holding those weapons. The world had never seen anything quite like it. Nothing on that scale, certainly. Nothing like what eventually happened on the trenches in the Western Front. But so where did it come from? Well, again, just to sum up some of the big developments. The positive side. We call it like the bright side of the ledger. Europe had produced some fantastic advances in human development, in wealth. Unfortunately, a lot of these were also in the realm of military technology. We talked a little bit about that the other day when we were looking at the scramble for Africa. Things like the machine gun, the Maxim gun, obviously much more mobile artillery, the grooved instead of smooth bore rifles we talked about, where essentially you could now knock someone off at several kilometers away with a rifle, which of course makes cavalry simply obsolete. That is, men on horseback, they can now be shot off at like a mile or 2 away, and so there's no way you can have a cavalry charge. A lot of people didn't really quite grasp it yet, including even some generals, that firepower was now so extreme that something like a fortress was basically obsolete. A lot of the European powers wasted lots of money on fortresses. That said, they spent money on weapons, on arms, that's all true, but they also spent money on other things. Things like public health and sanitation, schools, libraries, symphonies, orchestras. Whenever people talk about a golden age of this or that, if you look at like the great novels, the realistic novels in France, Émile Zola, Russia, obviously Tolstoy is probably the most famous. Even kind of America was already producing novelists, although they weren't yet as renowned as most of the European novelists. The golden age of opera, you have like Wagner and Puccini and something of Bizet, Carmen, that's my own favorite. A kind of golden era of painting. Impressionist paintings still tend to sell for more than any other kinds of paintings. That's, again, it starts around the kind of 1870s and 80s. So a lot of the wealth is going into artwork, the arts, things like libraries. We actually take this for granted in America, but it's pretty amazing. Almost any town of any size in America has a public library. And most of these date back to this kind of grandiose period of wealth in the 19th century, where despite all the excesses of industrial capitalism, it threw off enough wealth to eventually support things like public libraries, that is, with free access of the public to all of the great works ever written and published. Things like public health, sanitation. A lot of these things reinforce each other. I mean, obviously, something like infant mortality, that is the rate of death among newborn infants, because infant mortality is lower, that is, more babies survive. You got a huge boom in population, which is part of what led to this whole phenomenon that I talked about with colonization and imperialism. Some of it was just this demographic energy. Europeans with this humongous baby boom. I mean, Russia's population, for example, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, it's somewhere around like 35, 40 million. By the turn of the 20th century, it's already well more than 100 million. By 1914, I've seen different figures as high as 175 million. That's in Russia alone. Russia, of course, is not going the other way. Russia is losing about 800,000 people every year. It kind of shows you which way the wind is blowing in a way. Demographic health and vitality versus its opposite. I mean, in some ways, the story of, you might call it post-colonialism, or people like to call it the revenge of the oppressed or of the third world in the last 40 or 50 years. A lot of it is simple demographics. All of these countries in Africa and in the Middle East, they didn't have the baby boom that Europe did in the 19th century. That's part of the reason Europe was able to flex its muscles around the world in places like China and Africa, was because of demographic vitality. They had all of these young people bursting at the seams with energy and motivation. So all of that, again, this is sort of mostly on the positive side of the ledger. Obviously, you have these inventions. We talked about some of them already. Things like the transatlantic cables being laid, which kind of laid the groundwork for not only the British Empire, but really globalization full stop, because it enables almost instantaneous communications around the world. You have, obviously, things like coal, which allows ships now to move faster than ever before. It allows, obviously, trains with their steam engines, speed, the pace of life, the pace of everything from the movement of course, soldiers and munitions, but also the movement of goods, so that world trade is stimulated by all these improvements in communications. Now, obviously, at the very end of the era, you're talking about motor cars, and then in the early 20th century, also airplanes. But if you just think again about how astonishing it is that all of this is happening practically at once. I mean, it's literally like in the course of one lifetime. If you're born in like 1850, let's say somewhere in a small village in continental Europe, Austria, who knows where. Well, okay, your life is, in some ways different from that of your father and grandfather, but you still basically grow up with things like horses and carts, where you basically walk most places, where anybody who has a little bit of money might have like a carriage drawn by horses, but even there your mobility is limited by animal power. 50 years later, you not only have, of course, trains pretty much blanketing continental Europe, which allows anyone to hop on a train and get to the next major city in an hour or two. But now you have the spread of the internal combustion engine in cars, and very soon, if you just go to where you're like 60 or 70 years old, travel by aeroplane is going to be possible. Still, yes, kind of a minority affair. You just think of like the massive disruption in people's lives in terms of, again, expectations, lifestyle. Not just economics and productivity, but the whole kind of mental universe that people grow up in. Where everything that you knew was just basically your town and its immediate surroundings. And now, anyone really in the middle class who has any money at all can afford to travel all over the world. In some ways, again, it's kind of like that happened in Europe 100, 120 years ago. A lot of it actually just happened in the rest of the world in the last 20 or 30 years. Where people for the first time had enough pocket change to be able to afford the things that Europeans and then Americans took for granted 100 years ago. Except that back then it was still completely new. It was completely new. Yes, maybe if you were really rich, you could have previously afforded to travel through Europe on the Grand Tour. But sailing ships were so slow. Maybe you wanted to go to China. It would take 6 months to a year, and then you'd be there. You'd probably want to stay a couple years before you went back. Now you could get there in a couple of days. Now you could travel across the entire continental United States in 4 or 5 days. So you have a massive explosion in wealth, but also it's kind of disruptive because people's habits are changing, their mentalities are changing. You know, all of the old verities and certainties that you maybe learned from, again, your ancestors, your father, your grandfather, may no longer seem entirely true. You also had, of course, the whole phenomenon of industrialization. We talked a little bit about the Marxist, the socialist, the anarchist, the kind of, the more idealistic, collectivist answers to this problem. But here too you had an example where you might have the kind of job that had never existed before. Some of them, of course, were very unpleasant, like coal mining or a lot of manufacturing, where with textiles, for example, because they had to keep the rooms heated and to a very high degree of humidity, the workers tended to suffer. You had obviously much larger populations in the big cities. London was, of course, famously crowded and unsanitary. Unsanitary in part because, some technologies are racing ahead, but there's always kind of a lag time. So even after they invented the car, people were still using horses. And of course, the thing about horses now, it's more like an aristocratic affectation. Riding horses is something only the rich do. So we like to think about it as this nice, glamorous thing. But of course, there's nothing glamorous about thousands of horses in a city because, of course, what do? They all have to defecate. And so you had huge public health problems, based on what you do with, like, the horse manure. Based even on, before you had toilets and water closets, what do you do with human excrement? All these things we've completely forgotten about in the modern era. They're just starting to devise, again, I talk about public sanitation. By the end of the 19th century, they're finally beginning to solve some of these problems. They're beginning to plan out public health networks in cities. They're beginning to ease congestion by building, for example, actually Istanbul had, I think, Europe's first metro, although it was only a one-stop thing, the tunnel, which was actually built in the 19th century. Paris had a metro built right around the turn of the 20th century. So eventually, the urban planners are beginning to figure out some of these problems. But the problems are still there. Yes, life is great if you have enough money where you have a house in the countryside or you live in a part of town, where, again, it's kind of like only the rich live. But then they have, poor, crowded tenements in the other parts of town. In fact, one interesting fact of Europe, you can still notice this to a certain extent today, is that the richer neighborhoods, I hope I don't get this backwards, the richer neighborhoods were always in the West. There's a reason for that. Because of the prevailing wind currents. Because the poorer tenement areas tended to be in the east. Famously in London, like the East End, that's the working class area of London, right? And the reason, of course, is because the rich did not want to smell the poor, basically. Or more to the point, they did not want to smell, whatever smells the poor and their, animals made. Particularly because of, crowded, sweaty, unhealthy living conditions. So the rich areas, they tended to be cleaner, too. Cleaned by that fresh breath of air coming in across the countryside. And then, of course, by the time the air got to the poor districts, it was no longer quite so clean. So, again, inequalities, even just geographically in where you live, were beginning to exist. Now, here's, in some ways, this is kind of the crux of the issue for the socialists and the anarchists. Sometimes they exaggerated. And when it came to philosophy, and I'll talk about Marx's immiseration thesis in the second half of today's lecture, that is the idea that everyone is getting poorer, that wealth is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. They had it wrong in a lot of ways. Eventually, wealth was spreading beyond the poor classes. But that said, in the more kind of spiritual sense, they had a point. A lot of modern factory labor was profoundly alienating in the way that Marx described it, simply because you were no longer kind of connected to your work. You were no longer an artisan, let's say a cobbler, making shoes and feeling pride in your work. You might be just one of, an assembly line of workers just doing one repetitive thing because that was a more efficient way of organizing mass production. So that you wouldn't really feel much pride in what you were doing. And frankly, it would be really boring as well. So it's not just the kind of unsanitary, sweaty conditions. It's also the very fact that the work was kind of deadening and boring for a lot of people. And then that was combined with the fact that the immense wealth being thrown off is, of course, concentrated not necessarily in fewer and fewer hands, as Marx claimed, but definitely in few hands. There was great inequality. The wealthy were wealthier than anyone had ever been before. I mean, truly, colossally, obscenely wealthy. People like the so-called robber barons in America, Carnegie and Rockefeller, who were able to, partly through shrewdness, partly through ruthlessness, and things like monopoly pricing, what they would often do is they would undercut competitors by basically like selling things at cost, and then once they had cornered the market, then they would jack up the prices. A lot of these so-called cartels which were created, they were unethical business practices. The upshot of it all, though, was that if, like Carnegie, you were able to corner something like the steel market, or Rockefeller, the oil market in the early days of oil, you could be wealthy in a way that the Egyptian pharaohs would have envied. Now, I mean, Rockefeller, he had billions of dollars, and that's when a dollar actually bought you something. You're a billionaire today. You're rich. You can probably buy a couple of sports teams. No, I mean literally, you can probably buy like about 2 or 3 big sports teams, and then your wad is spent. Now, this is not to say you're poor, but that is to say there are finite limits to what $1 billion can actually buy you today. I know it sounds like $1 billion. There's a funny Austin Powers movie. I don't know if you guys saw it, when this guy, Mr. Evil, he falls asleep in 1968, and 30 years later, he tries to ransom something, and he says, "I want $1 million," and he doesn't realize that 30 years later, it's not really worth all that much. The same thing is kind of true of $1 billion. Yeah, it's a lot of money today, but the tiniest fraction of something like the U.S. federal budget. Whereas $1 billion in 1890, I mean, that meant you were like richer than most countries in the world. That meant that you could pretty much buy a country if you wanted to. You could like buy an island and create your own country if you wanted to. So when we're talking about the wealthiest people, we're talking about colossal, obscene wealth. And to their credit, eventually most of them did start giving it away. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and their like in America, they did endow a lot of these public libraries, orchestras, universities, things like that. They did eventually spend the money in decent ways. But still, if you were just kind of looking at society and thinking, like a lot of particularly young and idealistic people did, was this really right? Was it fair? That some few people should have so much and the many should have so little. You can see where these impulses behind socialism and anarchism came from. In fact, although socialism is, I think, more politically important, and so I'm going to devote really most of the second half of the lecture to that, anarchism was in some ways, I think, more typical of this particular era, the last 2 or 3 decades before the First World War. The major thing that the anarchists became kind of famous for was assassination. And they literally assassinated no less than 6 heads of state, including 2 American presidents. Let's see, the King of Spain. I always get confused about which of the monarchs were actually assassinated, because there were also attempted assassinations. The King of Serbia was assassinated in 1903. Then in Russia, it's not just, obviously the Tsar is assassinated in 1881, but in Russia, literally dozens of government officials were assassinated. Russia had its own particular version of anarchism, which is usually called populism, the so-called narodniki, who were, again, they weren't beholden to Marx and the kind of Marxist socialist ideas. They had their own peculiar Russian ideas. But they were similar to the Western notions of anarchism. And basically the idea was, it was kind of like this, they called it a deed. That is, a deed, like something you do, an act of protest. It was supposed to be almost like this symbolic cleansing thing. Again, to a non-anarchist, it seems a little crazy. Like, what do you accomplish by, killing a government official? In the case of Russia, you probably set back the cause of social reform and caused the government to get more paranoid and even more brutal in its repressive measures. So it's counterproductive, literally, in that sense. But that's not the way they thought about it. They're thinking about this kind of like ideal future world, and they don't know how they're going to achieve it. All they know is that the world that does exist is completely unjust and unfair, and something must be done about it. I mean, there's always been this impulse, and particularly in the modern era, when you have the level of fame, of a king or a politician or even a Hollywood celebrity. It's one of the reasons they all have bodyguards these days, is because it's an easy way to become famous, right? You try to assassinate a president. I mean, supposedly, what was his name, Hinckley, who tried to kill Reagan in 1981, he did it because he was trying to impress Jodie Foster, the actress. Like, he was in love with Jodie Foster, and so he tried to shoot the president. You could explain him. There's probably better ways of getting Jodie Foster's attention. But then again, are there? She doesn't know who this guy is. Now she's heard of him, right? Okay, maybe she didn't fall in love with him, but you kind of see where some of it's vanity, jealousy, some of it's just crazy loony bin stuff. But some of it was actual idealism. A lot of these anarchists really thought that by assassinating government officials, they were declaring this passionate protest against the existing order of things. But some of the times the lines blended together. What was socialism, what was anarchism? The anarchists, they would always try to attend the socialist congresses. They often wouldn't be allowed into the room because they were seen as, again, a disruptive force. I mean, anarchy literally means, the lack of order or the lack of government. And so it didn't make sense for the socialists who want to reorganize government to use the anarchists. But anyway, the impulse there was real. And it wasn't just the economic inequalities which were getting to them. I mean, the other issue which motivated both the anarchists, but even more so the socialists, was the creeping militarization of European life. And in some ways, this is probably most relevant to the subject of the First World War and where it came from. I'm just going to check where we are on time. Okay, good, because I heard some people out in the hall. I thought we were nearing the end of the first hour. I wanted to cover this at length because it's an extremely important structural factor behind the First World War. I mean, eventually when you get into things like the mobilization timetables, that the Germans have only so long to mobilize and make it to Paris by day 42, which means that their options are limited. All of that stuff is extremely important. But even beyond that, you have this question of how did we get armies the size of those of 1914. How did you get armies of millions of people? Well, some of it, again, is that they can afford these armies in a way they couldn't before, simply because of the wealth. I mean, if you go back to the earliest days of basically this phrase, which I'm going to use repeatedly here, the regiment. Where did I write the regiment? I'm not sure if I did. Well, anyway, I'll write it up here. The regiment, which is the kind of key unit of the modern European-style standing army. I mean, a regiment, literally, they're kind of billeted on the land. They're permanently there. There are these kind of like garrison towns that are just a part of the landscape now. And where it came from originally, I think originally it was the French king back in the 15th century who had first started. It's partly because they had all these mercenaries who, once they stopped paying them, they still had their guns and they would go around and disrupt things. And the kings were trying to control them. And so they'd say, look, we'll put you on a permanent salary so long as you serve the crown. That's where it went, that's where it kind of went back to originally. Although you could say there were, elements of this in the Roman legions. The idea of a standing army, a permanent army on salary. But that said, what had happened in the 19th century in some ways was unprecedented. For the most part, these standing armies in the early modern era, they could get large at the time of a major conflict. Like under the Sun King, the French eventually had something like 300,000 or 400,000 men under arms. But then after the wars, they would tend to dissipate. The same thing was true in the Napoleonic Wars. The French armies did field these huge masses of men. We talked about the Grande Armée, which invaded Russia. They weren't all French, but overall it was an army of maybe 650,000 men. But it was brought together for a particular purpose. It was brought together for the invasion of Russia. And after this failed, although Napoleon had to keep raising more armies as he's fighting this rearguard struggle to kind of preserve his position, he is finally outnumbered. I mean, at the Battle of the Nations, remember this was in 1813 in Leipzig. For the first time, the French were confronting armies as large as their own. But even so, we're talking here about, like 300,000 on one side, 350,000 on the other. That's pretty big if you compare it to the 7 Years' War. But then in 1914, remember I said by the end of August, there were 20 million men under arms. So now we're talking about, again, a factor of another 20. And then eventually even larger than that. a geometric increase, which again, you could say some of this is because of the Industrial Revolution, geometric increase in productive power, wealth, etc., etc. There was more to it than that, because I mean, after all, it wasn't necessary that they would spend this wealth on something like these mass conscription armies. Why did they do this? It's not really that easy to explain. I mean, there's some very general explanations. You look at something like nationalism, that's obviously a huge part of it, right? That Napoleon, remember, had motivated his men. They had the first kind of modern draft, the levée en masse. You were all now citizens. You're not just fighting for some king or some duke. You're fighting for your nation. You're fighting for the people. So some of it has to do with that. Now the French are motivated as Frenchmen, the Germans are motivated as Germans, and so on. In fact, that is one of the more interesting political developments of the era. This phrase is actually a book by a historian called Eugene Weber. He called it peasants into Frenchmen, by which he meant really quite literally that until this era, from roughly kind of the 1870s up to 1914, most people in France, he discovered in his research, didn't actually even speak French. They were little dialects. This is really true of the pre-modern world in general. It's not really until you get a centralized educational bureaucracy dispensing, these are the lessons, this is how you're supposed to speak. Here is like the new grammar, here's how everything is spelled, that everything gets standardized. In fact, that's a huge part of what becomes kind of nationalism and nationalist propaganda. It's made possible by the spread of education and mass literacy. After all, if you don't know how to read, you're not going to be able to read whatever works are deemed essential. Whether they're in France, kind of the works about the French Revolution and Napoleon, part of the national story, going back into the kings. The case of Germany, they now have their own version of kind of the national story, some of which also goes back to Napoleon, the resistance to Napoleon. In all the Balkan states, like Serbia, Bulgaria, some of it is kind of like invented history. They just like make stuff up, or they talk about some, grand medieval kingdom. Well, the thing is, none of this would have meant anything to you if you were an illiterate peasant. But once you're kind of plopped down, behind a desk in a schoolroom, and you're told that this is your story, well, you probably didn't know beforehand that that was your story. But now it is. It becomes your story. It's a process. It's a project to convince all of these, previously illiterate, now semi-literate peasants that they are part of this thing called France. Or later on, again, Germany, or later still, some of these kind of mini-states created in the Balkans, or later still, states like Yugoslavia, and then its successors. It's a project, nationalism. I mean, in some ways, it's even been called an invention. It's not like it just came out of thin air. I mean, obviously, the thing must have had some existence beforehand. But it's true, and this historian was right, that there was a major project to nationalize the French. And it was very specifically political, too. On the one hand, it was trying to legitimize the revolution, while also seeing Napoleon as a legitimate part of that story, which I always found a little bit difficult to square that circle. But they figured this out. It's not that they disowned the monarchs before, but they said that the revolution, it was a good thing, equality, fraternity, all of that stuff, is now embraced and accepted as the new establishment of modern France. Which, remember, for a lot of the 19th century was not necessarily true, because they go through all these governments, they have a restoration, they have a king, then they have Napoleon III. Now they've decided that France is a republic. In fact, Third Republic France is a big part of this story, and in a way it's a big part of your own story too, the story of modern Turkey, because a lot of the young Turks, and then later, of course, famously Kemal himself, not only did they read and speak French, they were influenced by French ideas and philosophy, particularly positivism. But they were also particularly influenced by laicism, or as you call it, laïclique, which was in some ways really the key animating concept of state education, or as we might call it more cynically, propaganda in Third Republic France. You sometimes see this phrase anti-clericalism. Now, what that meant literally was that the state was taking control of the schools. You can see why this issue matters for Turkey. Because the schools traditionally had been the province of the church. the Catholic Church. As we call it in the Protestants, we call it Sunday school. But it was more than Sunday. I mean, it was actually your basic education was handled by the church. So to the extent that you learned to read and write, you basically learned to read and write whatever the church wanted you to read and write. You know, a little bit like some of these controversies in modern Turkey about things like Imam Hatip schools. This was hot stuff in Third Republic France. You know, this is what people argued about. You know, the traditionalists, the monarchists, the conservatives, the Catholics, they didn't really like this new stuff the state was selling in the schools. Eventually, though, they went along with it. The state basically had the money, the state had the taxes, the state had the power. Eventually, they lost, pretty much. So you got, again, peasants into Frenchmen. You got this new pseudo-religion of patriotism to replace the previous thing, which was, you know, you're a peasant and you're a Christian. Right now, you're a Frenchman. And that matters because this is what supposedly is going to motivate you to fight for your country. I mean, the way they thought about it, again, we have to remember that nationalism in the 19th century, the kind of stuff I'm talking about, was a progressive idea. It's not like we tend to think about it today as something that's more like benighted, reactionary, backwards, right wing. It was, in fact, very much a progressive cause. There's a quote here from a book by John Kagan, which I think is particularly interesting. This is actually from 1905, a debate in the French Chamber of Deputies. From time to time, you know, they would debate something like expanding conscription, that is, expanding the draft, or extending the length of service that everyone who was drafted had to do. You know, again, like universal conscription like you have in Turkey, this is obviously an important part of the state turning people into citizens loyal to the republic. So, anyway, a deputy gets up and he remarks, again, to support a kind of increase in the conscription levy. He says, quote, "It is from the lofty ideas born of the French Revolution that the military ideas of a great republican democracy must be inspired. And when, after more than a century, the legislator can ask all citizens, without distinctions of wealth, instruction, or education, to consent to give an equal part of their time to their country, without exceptions and privileges of any sort, the proof is there that the democratic spirit has once again bound up the chains of time." The democratic spirit. Now, it's not that he's wrong. I mean, the argument makes sense in a lot of ways. I'll give you an example, actually, contemporary terms. Here in Turkey, as you all know, although there are, if you have money, there are ways of limiting your military service, right? You can do like the really short version, which is just a couple of weeks or something, I think. Do I have that right? Is it 2 weeks or a month or something? This is only, I think, for people who live outside the country. It's like for expatriate Turks. People inside the country, you have like the 6-month version or the 12-month version, I believe, right? So you have different versions, but still everybody has to do it, right? That's important. In Russia, as you might have heard, if you have money, you don't have to do it at all. In America, during the Vietnam War, this stuff was, of course, deeply controversial because they gave deferments to college students. Now, part of the reason they did that, it was a particularly, I think, obnoxious and explosive way of handling the issue because it led to class resentment. You know, the rich who can afford to go to college didn't have to serve. They actually did it for really cockamamie reasons. It was partly because of the baby boom after the Second World War. They had more soldiers than they could actually take in, and so they created all these little exemptions. The point made by this French legislator, whose name actually escapes me, is that the whole idea of a universal draft, again, going back to the levée en masse, it is inherently democratic. Now, again, we tend to attach certain labels to terms like democracy. Like today, everyone seems to agree that democracy is a good thing, right? It's a good thing. Whereas whatever is the opposite of democracy is a bad thing. But here's the thing. Democracy might have certain qualities that are good and positive and might have others which are potentially dangerous. An example of this, of course, being a mass conscription army, which is egalitarian and democratic in that there are no longer exemptions based on wealth, birth, etc. But it also means if the other countries are doing this too, you're going to have a couple of really large armies who are now going to collide in such a way that millions of people are going to end up dead. which is what happened in 1914. Now, you can't necessarily fault this man or all those French legislators who voted, to expand the conscription. Now, some of what the French were doing is specifically because of what happened in the Franco-Prussian War. I mean, in some ways, the Franco-Prussian War was kind of the key event of the whole second half of the 19th century. A key not because it was a long war. It wasn't all that disruptive, although in Paris they did have this brief episode I talked about called the Paris Commune, where artisans kind of rose up and took over the city, and then their rebellion was crushed with all the bloodshed. This is where, if you've been to Paris, the famous Church of the Sacred Heart, the Sacré-Cœur, was built to expiate the sins of violence. In strategic terms, though, its importance cannot be overestimated. Some of this was just to do with things like, tactics and training and logistics. The Germans mastered, obviously, the use of trains, to transport soldiers more quickly. The German officers were shown to be more effective because, they did their staff work better because they had a war college. So now everyone wants a war college and a general staff. The German soldiers were all literate. They could read and write. And so now all the other armies want to do that too. But even beyond all of these kind of technical considerations, which are important, a couple of things happened. Germany is now larger and more powerful than France, meaning it has a larger population base to draw on, which means that the French are desperate not only for revenge, but of course they have to find a way of getting that revenge. And the only way they can do it is by expanding conscription, that is, by putting more and more people into the army. I mean, the French, by the time of the First World War, they were conscripting everybody into the army. Okay, I'm talking about men, I'm not talking about women, but like everybody. They were conscripting monks. They were conscripting men, who weren't necessarily lame, but who were definitely not of what we would usually consider to be military age, or even disposition. I mean, monks are almost by definition pacifists, and they conscripted them too. The Germans didn't have to be so extreme. And that's partly because they had a larger population. But it's also because the Prussian officers believed a little bit more in quality as opposed to quantity. That said, though, the Prussians had a lot to do with what happens to Europe in the last decades before 1914. Partly because, again, the simple fact that they won. Moltke the Elder, who is, by general consensus, the architect or the mastermind of the Prussian victory, basically, everyone wanted to know what his secret was. So the reporters, they come ask you, how is it that you routed and embarrassed the French in, just a matter of weeks? And he said, well, I've been reading this book by Clausewitz called On War. Aha! So here you begin to see where theories and ideas begin to impact events and institutions. Some of it was happening already, all this stuff about, nationalism, propaganda, indoctrination, all that was happening already. But now it starts to take on a new momentum because Clausewitz suddenly becomes, the guy, he died unknown, like a lot of kind of eventually famous authors. He died like 1831, nobody knew who he was. 40 years later, though, the world-famous general, the victor of the Franco-Prussian War, endorses his book, and suddenly it becomes his runaway bestseller. Now, Clausewitz, again, to boil down the theory to its essence, it's not really that easy to summarize. There's a lot of stuff in the book which is actually very subtle and rich and complicated, to do with like the play of chance on the battlefield and so on and so forth. But the essence of what people usually, in the kind of bastardized version of Clausewitz, are talking about. First, it's the famous quote that war is the continuation of politics by other means, which you've probably heard some version of that quote. The idea that war kind of should be political, or at the very least that war can help solve political problems. Where was this coming from? Well, Clausewitz basically was a child of the Napoleonic Wars. And so he had seen not only the effect of these mass conscription armies, but he had seen also the effect of kind of motivation of the citizen armies of France. Now, as a Prussian, he didn't want to copy the French exactly. He knew that their armies had proved to be kind of more powerful than other armies, in part because of whatever was motivating the soldiers. He didn't want Prussia to become a democracy exactly. Kind of like Bismarck, famously said he didn't want any disgraceful connection with democracy. Clausewitz was no Democrat. But he thought that if the generals, in these kind of staff academies in Prussia, if they studied war seriously enough, they thought as hard as they could about war. They designed, the most effective army. They came up with what he called almost true war. The notion of a war where the soldiers have this perfect discipline and obedience and motivation. Then eventually you can use this war, to achieve your ends. You can have a decisive victory in the battlefield. You can achieve whatever ends your state needs to achieve. That is, you can make war political. It's a very convincing sort of an argument on the surface. And it's not that he just went right ahead and said directly, you need to have massive citizen armies. But what he was kind of arguing was that in the end, it was a good thing that states would study the science of war and that states would try to modernize and perfect their armies as these kind of war-making machines. Now, it's not exactly what he said that mattered. It was more like the way it was interpreted. Clausewitz supposedly had taught the Prussians how to field this super-modern army that was capable of this decisive victory in 1871 over the French, which achieved the political object of German unification. And if it worked for them, then everyone started to think maybe it can work for us too. And so the French study Clausewitz and the Russians study Clausewitz. And everyone starts studying warfare in its higher aspects, general staff academies. And of course, they start to think about things like logistics and training and the number of soldiers. The French decide, they need as many soldiers as possible. The Russians decide we need to speed things up, and so they start doing things like investing in strategic railways. But the Russians also decide that they need to have a larger army, which was a problem because Russia wasn't really rich enough to pay for an army. They had so many people. The Russians actually, unlike the French, the Russians would not have been able to afford conscripting everyone into the army. It's one of the funniest stories in one of Norman Stone's books is that they, a little bit like the Americans during the Vietnam War, they had to devise exceptions to the rule of conscription because otherwise they would have had too many people and it would have been too expensive. And so they came up with an exemption for what they called breadwinners. That is, a man who supported a family. And as soon as they made this exception, 2 million men got married immediately. As a brilliant way of kind of like getting out of military service. But anyway, all of this stuff starts to happen, and it's blending together with other developments. Like we've heard about Darwin, social Darwinism. Yeah, again, the bastardization of the theory, Darwin himself and his ideas were much more complicated. But the idea that you took the survival of the fittest, among species and animals, and you applied it to people and particularly races of men. Suddenly the idea was out there that some races were like progressive and and strong, and others were degenerate and weak. And this led to various things like cults of youth, all of these like young patriotic military associations, almost like paramilitary groups, where you're starting to be trained in the use of, first it's things like knives and tools and then eventually weapons. Like the Boy Scouts date to this era. There are a lot of versions of them on the European continent. All of this stuff produces it's a little bit like this warrior society that's just kind of hidden there, like it's in secret. Because everyone does the military service. They don't stay in the army. Just like in Turkey today, right? You serve your time, and then most people go back to civilian life. But you kind of kept your draft card. So that in the case of what would be called mobilization, that is general mobilization, the case of war, the case of a crisis, you knew where to report. So that an army, let's say like the Russian army, which was by 1914 maybe the standing army, the peacetime army, was already 1.4 million. That could be roughly tripled or quadrupled immediately in the case of mobilization. Russia would suddenly have, okay, it's the Russians, so it doesn't all happen at once. It takes a little while. But, within a month, 6 weeks, Russia would have an army of like 5 or 6 million men. So that it's there. It's not that it's invisible, but it's a little bit like an iceberg. You can only see the tip of it. This warrior society that the Europeans had created, particularly over the last several decades, but really going back to the Napoleonic Wars. Some of it due to, again, the spread of wealth allowing them to afford larger armies than ever before with more accurate and deadly weapons than ever before. but also the fact that social organization is more sophisticated than ever before. The governments are more involved in things like the schools, teaching of languages, national stories, propaganda, indoctrination. And then, of course, the simple organization of the armies, which on the Prussian model has gotten more sophisticated. Now Europe is, while still at peace, it is potentially this warrior society more lethal than any the world had ever known, which in the course of, again, just several days of some crisis which would cause the governments to declare mobilization, this warrior society could spring forth, as if just kind of like welling up from the ether. Destructive power, unlike any the world had ever seen. I think we're towards the end of the first hour, so let's take a short break, and when we get back, I want to look more closely at the socialists.